Thank you for joining us this morning to remember and to honor and to mourn our very dear friend, Paul Hamburg, Paltiel Chaim, Ben Daniel Dov Halevi Velea, a beloved son to Daniel and Lillian Hamburg, brother of Eric and Joel, beloved husband of Rabbi Mimi Wiesel, father of Gabi and Yuval, and the stepfather of Rabbi Michael Shefrin. Paul was the beloved Zayde and Saba of Ella, Nina, Ilya, Zohar, Uriah, Jacob, and Maya. We will begin this morning service with Psalm 130. Shir lamalot mimamakim karaticha Adonai, Adonai shima bekoli, tieina oznecha kashuvot lekol tachanunai, im avonot tishmor ya Adonai, mi ya'amod. כי עמך הסליחה למען תברר. קיוויתי אדוני כפתה נפשי, ולי דברו הוכלתי. נפשי לאדוני משומרים לבוקר, שומרים לבוקר. יחל ישראל אל אדוני, כי עם אדוני החסד, והרבה עמו פדות, והוא יפדה את ישראל מכל עוונותיו. According to our tradition, one is forbidden from delivering the eulogy during the month of Nisan, the time of our deliverance from Egypt, as this entire month is considered festive-like. I can imagine that Paul would have delighted in the somewhat bitter irony that a man who dedicated the best years of his life to the love of words would be denied words in the time of his departure from the world of words. I can also envision Paul reminding me somewhat excitingly that an exception would be made for rabbis and scholars. He must have read it somewhere, and given some time, he would be glad to find the source. Paul, however, would then also remind me that he once attended rabbinical school for a brief time in the early 70s. But alas, he would have said. I bet there's no exception for a rabbinical school dropout. And before Paul would go down the usual path of modesty and humility and perhaps even self-deprecation, I myself would insist that he was a scholar, and perhaps even more so as a master librarian at UC. Paul served as a rabbi, or better yet, a rebbe, to many young would-be scholars. And so, Paul, given my younger age and the proper way of the world, I get the last word. And it is in that spirit that I and others will be sharing our eulogies today for a deeply beloved Rebbe and a mentor of scholars. In arranging the Pesach Haggadah, the Passover Haggadah, the sages established a guiding principle, Matchil bignut u'mesayem b'shevach. The arc of a good story should begin in a place of degradation and reach towards a climactic point of praise. Despite being a man of words, Paul's life didn't always exactly follow the sage's narrative principle. His life had ups and downs and highs and lows and downs and ups and lows and highs. And some chapters didn't seem to always fit together. How else can one explain the story of the kibbutz dairyman, beloved by his young calves, which he helped birth, who later on in his 40s went back to school to become a librarian, a beloved by his young scholars. And yet, when told this way, the story almost sounds biblical. The disparity and chasms brought about by Paul's difficult departure from Israel and his reemergence as UC's librarian does not follow the principle set by the rabbis from degradation to praise entirely neatly. For years, Paul carried the burden of that weighty decision, his return to America, a choice that felt choiceless to him. In many of our conversations, Paul shared the pain he felt and the pain he inadvertently caused. And he often reflected on the deliberate steps he had taken to try to mend his ways and repair the past. Gabi and Yuval, your father loved you to no end. He valued deeply the people you had become as adults and the families you created for yourselves. And he cherished every opportunity he got to spend with you. And above all, he was utterly overwhelmed by the love and connection that he ultimately felt he had with you. That shevach, that praise rightfully belongs to all of you. The arc of this story also led to Paul's Mimi. When Paul and Mimi first met each other in LA, Paul was not looking to get into a relationship. And so it took him time to understand that the friend and rabbi he had met would eventually become both his Rebbe and the love of his life. Paul adored you. And that's a complete and utter understatement. Paul and Mimi nourished each other, delighted in each other's music and books, in each other's children and grandchildren, delighted in each other. And Mimi's love for Paul taught him patience and forgiveness. Mimi softened him and tended to his wounds. And Mimi gave Paul the courage to love again, to forgive again, and to live more fully again. And that love also brought Michael and then Michael's family into Paul's life. And there is so much shevach, songs of praise, in the deep love and care you shared together. The last 6 years of Paul's life and the years preceding the move to Florida were tinged by gnai, by the pain and the painful degradation and the real challenges of illness. Paul struggled enormously with the meaning of his disease, intellectually, emotionally, and spiritually, and he battled. He battled and he demonstrated incredible, unimaginable resilience as he experienced the ongoing deterioration of his physical and mental capacities. I know, and I think all of you know, that at those times, Paul was fueled by Mimi's fierce love and care, and by his deep relationship with Gabi and Yuval and Michael and their spouses and their children and his grandchildren. I also would like to believe that Paul was aided by his capacity to tell a good story. At severe and extreme medical moments, Paul would sometimes forget that he was ill and unwell. His nurses reported that he once announced pages for the beginning of prayer services, thinking he was the rabbi. And another time, he gave specific instructions to the nurse about how to arrange books in the correct historical order. And even reached out his hand, as I just did, for an imaginary book his mind conjured. And I'd like to believe that this was another way with which Paul confronted his illness. He told himself stories, and he escaped back to a place and a time he truly loved. He came back to the books at UC and the community that he so deeply loved right here in this sanctuary and in Berkeley. So after all that, I'd like to give Paul the last word. And so I will suggest that perhaps this was part of Paul's last word to all of us in the last chapter of his life. It is a lesson about his resolve and his capacity to transform gnai, pain, and hardship into a different story, even into shevach, even into praise. That to me seems to be the running principle of Paul's life story, from gnai to shevach, with highs and lows and downs and ups. May his memory be for a blessing and for praise. Amen. This time I will call up Rabbi Michael Sheprin, Paul's stepson, to deliver remarks in honor of Paul and reflections on the narrative of his life.
Thank you, everyone, for being here. I want to take a moment before I say some words just to share with those of you who are joining us on live stream. I just want you to see this beautiful sanctuary, these holy souls in this sacred space that Paul thrived. Paul thrived here Jewishly, intellectually, communally, and returning to a place of strong Jewish identity to share these words. It just feels right. So much of what I prepared, my friend and teacher just shared with far more grace than I could. So you'll forgive me while I fast forward through some of my thoughts. From what I know of Paul's upbringing, his childhood with Joel and Eric and his parents was sweet and generous and afforded him all of the opportunities that he wanted. And that was so important because what he wanted was so different than I think anyone really knew what to do with. While they were always active in temple life, It was Paul who went every Shabbat with his grandfather. It was Paul who dove most deeply into Jewish learning and Jewish practice. You could say he was a seeker. His seeking took him to UC San Diego for undergrad, to Israel to immerse more deeply in Hebrew, finally making Aliyah, taking on the mantle of serving in the IDF, before the seeking brought him back here to Berkeley. I think a lot about the image that I just learned, actually, of the man that we knew, who often was sitting behind a desk or at a chair at a table with books and books and books and magazines and articles and more books. I think of the image of him crawling on his belly, dismantling landmines while serving. I think of the image covered in living fluids while birthing calves. I think of his hands in the soil planting seeds. He had so many sides. But his life in Berkeley here was as he hoped. It was filled with study, artistic inspiration and stimulation, bike riding, and lots of coffee. I say that, and I think many of you have had the pleasure of watching the French press slowly go down in the midst of conversation. And his studies took him to that master's in library science, which brought him to the Simon Wiesenthal Center in LA, where he served as the reference librarian, where his biting and dark sense of humor would sometimes lead to the phrase of "there's no business like Shoah business." That biting sense of humor, not everyone was privileged to see. But he had it. He could sit quietly at a table while conversations were circulating around him for an hour, and then pop up with a one-liner, absolutely flooring the room to tears of laughter. But the biggest smile and the greatest laughter was actually Paul, cracking himself up, smiling and giggling with such innocence. It was so beautiful. I think his time here was the most fulfilling, the happiest, and the most impactful in all of his days. I'm so honored to stand here today, having been Paul's stepson, in particular as the rebellious young adult that I was when I met him, to have been treated so kindly and non-judgmentally, and with so much love. It's such a blessing and zchut to be influenced by his spirit, his intellect, the gentle way he walked through the world dressed in earth tones with that cap and that special pace. And he gave that same welcome to my wife and to my kids and to the entire side of my mom's family, who all adored him. It's so fitting that in future years, we'll look back on his yahrzeit and know that Passover is coming because this is Paul season. Images of that humble man that was spoken of being forced into leading the Passover Seder and doing it with such love and smile. He was polite with all of us. He earned the respect of colleagues and students. He made friendships, but not by going out and seeking to build friendships. He just made friendships by holding space for people's interests, sharing his own. He just allowed for the most fascinating conversations. For many, he very quietly was a trusted guide into the worlds of wisdom and creativity. And I don't imagine that he was always like this. As was said, he did not have the easiest life. I think overcoming or seeking to overcome, seeking to heal what broke, seeking to heal and bring closer what was so distant. And in his final days, so clearly articulating that he wanted to have moments of joy. I think they were the counteraction to all of the challenges in his life. And yet he never complained. He was always so gentle, even in his hardest days. And I think he didn't really complain because he was proud. Proud of his family, of his children, of their choice in spouses, of their beautiful grandchildren, of his friends, of my mom, of course. And I hope and I pray that he was as proud of him as we are. He was a walking card catalog of information. He was Google before Google. And when you needed some piece of information, he wouldn't just find it. He would take you on a journey to finding it. He was so worldly, and he took everything so seriously. And he would also be the first to tell you that he does not play games. There was a lot of fun in him. I think it's his learning, his wisdom, his knowledge that are his legacy. I know many of us here have learned from him and with him, and yet there is still more to learn. And I think that is what Paul wants for us, for the learning, creativity, the exploration, the seeking, not to stop. In Pirkei Avot, we learn Ben Bagbag, Hu Omer hafoch ba v'hafoch ba v'chol haba. We are to turn it over and turn it over again, for within it everything is found. That we should look into it until we become gray and old within it. And we should not move away from it because we shall have no better portion than it. Well, this Mishnah is speaking specifically about the Torah. I feel that it's also speaking about the Torah of Paul. That his teachings, his wisdom, his inspiration should not ever stop. That we should turn it over and turn it over. It's my great fortune to have known and loved Zup, our Zadie Unkie Paul. May he be remembered for all the good he did in this world.
At this time, I'll call up Eric Hamburg, Paul's brother.
Thank you, rabbis. Just amazing, beautiful words and recollections. And frankly, can you hear me now? Just amazing recollections. And frankly, lots of things I didn't know about my brother. Over the past few days, I have tried to write something that would reflect my recollections, my feelings. I've done this a few times for other people who have passed and were close to me, and I've tried to find some kind of kernel of truth that would be both praising and reflect the true nature of the relationship. And that didn't work. But what I reflect on is first of all, the fact that Paul and Joel and I had the most wonderful, loving parents, Lillian and Dan, who are both gone. And they were wonderful, loving people. We wanted for nothing. But over the past week, standing with Mimi and Paul's daughter, Gabby, in the hospital as he was dying, I got to spend some time, rare time, with Gabby, who have always felt a special place in my heart. But because of our lives and Paul's lives and whatever, never really spent that much time with. But there was a connection there. Just a wonderful, strong woman, just like Yuval is a strong young man. Not so young anymore. And Gabby and I had a chance to go to lunch and talk about relationships in our families and how well or how not so well we communicated and related to one another. And she gave me a perspective of her relationships with her family and also how my parents related to conflict and difficulty, and to some degree, not dealing with it by pushing it aside. And I remember talking to my mother, wonderful, wonderful woman, who grew up in a household with her parents that was very contentious and very angry, and how she kind of grew up not wanting to be around any of that. So we had a very peaceful, placid existence, but we also didn't really learn how to give back and forth. And all of this is to say, and it's a long story, and I'm not going to take up a lot of time here, but Paul and I were of different ages and almost different generations. When I was going into high school or whatever, he was off in college, and then he was off doing all these other things. And there was no connection. There was no understanding. It's not like he was my big brother. He was just this presence and this brain going along and doing the things that he wanted to do. And that's fine, because I was doing the same thing. My pithy remark for this is that we are responsible for our own trip and our own relationships and our own insecurities and fears of how we deal with one another. And we just never formed that kind of connection. But because of my parents being the focal point, we were always together at Thanksgiving. We were all the most special time in everybody's life, my cousins and everybody, Michael. And so we were together there, and Paul was there and I was there. And then as the years went on, we'd occasionally casually talk. And whenever I had a conversation with Paul, it was like, what are you reading? Surprise. But it was always, interesting, because there was this eclectic nature for both of us of what we were reading and what we were interested in. So the connection was not lost, but it was not, I guess, in a dream life you would like it to be. But that's true. With the introduction of Mimi into his life, the connection was stronger. And because of, and everybody knows how special Mimi is, and everybody who knows me personally knows how unreligious I am, because I lost that connection at the point after the bar mitzvah because I didn't get inspired. But anytime that Mimi was involved, and spoke, I felt spiritually a truth. The words were the most important things. So I'll wrap up here. Throughout his illness, long illness, I reiterate what the rabbis have said about his courage. And I tried to express that to him, that I understood that and I felt that, and I was proud of that. And I truly am just a very brave man who went through so much more. I got dealt the wrong hand, that even though we have very similar genes, he suffered. And for the moment, I'm okay. Anyway, it was very valuable for me to be with Mimi and Gabby and Michael in Florida the past few days, and to help bring his life to a compassionate end. And I'm so happy to be here with Kathy and to share with all of this and hear everybody's stories of him. And, you know, no matter what I've said or what the experience is, I loved my brother. And I wish everybody well.
Yeah, we'll invite now Dr. Naomi Seidman. In many ways will give expression, I think, to what many on the faculty at our university feel.
Thank you so much for Mimi for inviting me to speak. And I'm very conscious that I speak not only for myself, but for all the, I don't know, this community of people who take out books from the UC Berkeley Library and who experienced Paul as a librarian, but so much more. And when I was thinking about what that kernel of how to describe Paul, I thought about the phrase, about the value of hachnasat orchim, welcoming of guests, as a kind of the way I experienced Paul most immediately. And I remembered that Derrida gave a really powerful expression of Levinas's philosophy at his funeral, in which he distilled Levinas's philosophy, which is sometimes talked about as ethics, into the quality of hospitality. That Levinas's ethics could be described as not only an ethics of hospitality, but ethics as hospitality. And I think this is something that Derrida experienced in Levinas's house. And I certainly experienced it in Paul and Mimi's house. And just to say a little bit more about Levinas's philosophy of home, it's in his first great book, Totality and Infinity. He talks about the home as a place of asylum, a necessary refuge from a world of transitions. And I think that that's certainly true of Paul and Mimi's house, that this house was a house of, the temporary was always part of it, and yet the refuge and the asylum and the kind of the stop of the continual displacement was also felt in it. But that what was important about the home for Levinas is that once one found this kind of refuge, it could be opened to the other. And maybe I'll just read a little bit from Derrida's eulogy for Levinas, where he talks about the host who welcomes, the one who welcomes the invited guest. The welcoming host who believes himself the owner of the house is in reality a guest welcomed in his own house. He receives the hospitality that he offers in his own house. He receives hospitality from his own house, which ultimately does not belong to him. the host is a guest. And I want to try to flesh out how I saw that in Paul and Mimi's house. First of all, just what a house it was. I think it was on Arch Street. Real estate envy is a feature of life in the Bay Area, but there was something really special about that house. And I remember, first of all, the two really large rooms that were there for gatherings. There also talks about gatherings. And then the really small quarters in the back of the house that were the private part, the tiny kitchen, the tiny bathroom, the tiny bedroom. I never got a real peek into the bedroom, but I did spend some time in that kitchen, and the smallest rooms for their own lives and the biggest rooms for these gatherings. And in some ways, the library also became a home when Paul was the Judaica librarian. And I was just reminded that Lee Beerson, a friend of Paul's and a friend of so many of us in the room, at one point was searching out a book, and there was nothing Paul liked better than a good search for a book. And Lee, like so many people in Berkeley, there are so many people who, let's just say, are adjacent to the world of professional scholarship that are amateur scholars. And for Paul, there was just no distinction between someone who had a library card and had the right to walk into the UC Berkeley library fully, and anybody who wanted a book. I mean, all those people were seekers who deserved Paul's full and absolute attention, and there was nothing more important than finding that book. And there was something about Paul and Mimi's time at the heart of this community of scholars, which was so much more than just scholarship, that is distilled in this phrase, Hachnasat Orchim. And I'm thinking specifically about these literary salons that started before your time. I'm sorry about this evil spirit that has lodged in my throat. But the literary salons that were there was something about the period in which the literary salons were regularly held at this beautiful home, which Mimi and Paul made together, that was so much a refuge for the two of them, but that opened up to create a space for the community, in which a certain quality of, let's say, tzimtzum, the psychological tzimtzum, in which Paul would back off to allow other people to read from their work. I remember hearing Robert Alter reading from his translation in progress on those yellow legal pads, and everybody else. Suddenly we discovered all these people's talents and heard their voices in such a powerful way. It was a kind of intimacy that almost the evenings almost always ended with Paul himself playing the piano. And then as his condition, as it became more and more difficult for him to play piano, he started to play this repertoire of music for left hand, of Wittgenstein's brothers, famous music composed for him when he could only play with his left hand, that Paul would always explain to us what this music was, and then play a little bit. And it was a kind of performance of both a mastery that's, let's say, this was his home, this was his music, that was always inflected with the vulnerability of his own physical condition that he was willing to share with us, to be a kind of guest in his own home. There's something about homeness here in Berkeley, and I'll just end with this, which is that for all the years I've been living here, it's never entirely felt like home. Mimi emailed me yesterday from an airport, and I was in an airport when I got the email, and people in Berkeley are always coming and going, visiting professors and graduate students who eventually graduate. And there's something about the being buried here in Berkeley, the permanence and the, I don't know, the rootedness of that always brings into stark relief this feeling I have that we're not entirely at home. And I think Paul is a kind of model for what it means to be both a host and a guest in one's own home. Thank you.
I'd like to invite Nathan Wexler, who's a student or much more Talmud of Paul, who also will give voice to the many people who felt mentored by Paul.
Hi, it's nice to be in this space. And I'll just share a few memories of what it was like to work for Paul and to be his disciple. You know, we would go up into his little office up high in the palace of the library. I see some of the other librarians here. It's good to see you guys. And he would send me on these great errands, you know, because I was at some point kind of his legs while he was, you know, orchestrating different people's searches and his own scholarly quests. And he would send me down through the back stairs and show me all these secret passageways through the library down into the stacks to find, you know, his piles of books he would want for whatever it is we were looking for. And then we would come back and we would discuss them. And he would sometimes also lead me himself on great quests, you know, to the Bancroft to go looking at first editions of the printed Zohar or to look at the artist books that he loved, find these little kernels of beauty in this great forest of books that he was so in love with. One of our greatest adventures, we took a field trip over to San Francisco to look for Sutro's lost library. In the bowels of libraries across San Francisco, there were, you know, boxes of books that Sutro 100 years ago, Mayor Sutro had gathered from Palestine at the time. And, you know, felt like we were Indiana Jones or something going his search. And even as it wasn't so easy for him to get around, his excitement was really, you know, leading us on. And we would always stop at a cafe, different cafes to get coffee. You know, we would work during the day and he would say, okay, it's time for a coffee break. And we would go down to get a coffee and discuss whatever we were reading or learning about the news. And I really leaned on him at those years too. You know, my mother was going through a severe illness, and when she passed, and you know, my romantic tragedies and triumphs, you know, I really leaned on Paul. Yeah, as we would wander down to the cafe. So I have many, many sweet memories in this sort of gilded Berkeley golden time. And I'm so grateful for his mentorship and his friendship and yeah, his excitement.
I'll invite up Rabbi Harry Breckner, who I believe was responsible for introducing Rav Mimi and Paul, for officiating at their wedding, and who will be officiating at the funeral later this afternoon. Thank you for being here.
I think it was really my wife Rayanne who did the full push. I did tell Paul that I didn't want to write the novel, you know, The Holocaust and the Single Librarian. So, you know, in Hebrew, there's two words that I can think of about connection. One is a kesher and one is a chibor. A kesher is a knot. Knots get untied. If you play with the three letters of kesher, you get sheker, an untruth. A chibor connects to friendship. A chibor is a connection that can never be severed. It's a connection that's forever. And I think for me, It's how Paul lives inside me. You know, when I met Paul, I was still pretty young. I think we've known each other over 32, 33, I haven't counted years. You know, Paul was my downstairs neighbor in Los Angeles, and he would go for bicycle rides. I don't know how many miles. Sometimes he would do what he called a century, which would be a whole 100 miles. He would still make it to a Hashkama Minyan at I don't know what time. And then he would have coffee for me. Like I would leave my apartment and there would be Paul with, oh, I got your red eye. So I drank a red eye, but I think Paul drank a double red eye. I think it was 4 shots of espresso over brewed coffee. But, you know, I was this kid who didn't have a lot of privilege growing up. And, you know, I often joke about Obaskala. There were a lot of holes in my education. And Paul lovingly filled them. And it's still inside me. And it's not that he just lovingly filled them, but, you know, there are people who are friends who also can teach. And there's teachers who just want to pour knowledge into you. And Paul had massive knowledge to pour everywhere. And then there are the teachers who help light that candle that you are, so you can have your own light. Paul had the magic of giving me fuel and helping me light my own candle, all at the same time. I like to think that I was able to kick Paul plenty of times. I think I pulled him off the edge more times than I want to think about. But that sense of deep chibo, deep connection, because through that encounter with Paul early on, and then over all of these decades, he changed me. He made me some of who I am. And I'm always grateful. I was always grateful that he found the kind of love he did with Mimi. You know, to understand all those pieces of Paul takes someone more than special, someone who's really remarkable and incredible. And he was a beautiful soul. And I hope that all of us have that sense of chibo. All of us have that place that Paul's going to be inside us. You know, it teaches in Pirkei Avot that, you know, real love, you know, the ahava she'eno tluya b'davar, unconditional love, that's forever. And I think Paul was able to host because even though he didn't always show that love for himself, and it took him a lifetime, I think, to get to that place that he really understood that I could love myself, that I'm enough, and that people really do love me. I can't tell you all the tricks that Ran and I pulled just to find out his birthday. February 6th, by the way, because we wanted to throw him an Ubermensch party, because I used to joke that he was my Ubermensch. But, you know, that love, it never goes away. That love is always there. You know, I don't know how he's going to pull a book off a shelf, but I think all scholars in some level, the books find us, right? We don't always find the books find us, and Paul helped those books to find us. And may when those books fall off shelves into our hands, and when we get new insights, we could remember, at least I will remember, because Paul, for me, was a foundational and beautiful friend who I'm going to deeply miss. Thank you.
Mimi.
Just want to see you all. And you, all of you. Paul was my Yedid Nefesh, the beloved of my soul. And when we first met, when I was in rabbinical school here in California, in LA. And then I left for Israel and for New York. Every Kabbalat Shabbat, Yedid Nefesh was always a beautiful piyut, but it had so much more for me and for Paul, because we were thousands of miles away. But through the distance, we were connected. We had that chibur. When Paul and I first started going out together after Harry and Rayanne pushed us together, I'm so grateful. We once were sitting in a cafe, because that's what you did with Paul. And he would talk about his father-in-law, Heine, who was a scholar. And he spoke of this man with such deep love and admiration. And it was just spectacular to watch. And I wanted some of that. Anybody who could love that deeply, it was just, that's when I first truly fell deeply in love with him. And through the love that we shared, my nefesh expanded. The words you all spoke, so true, so powerful, so meaningful. When Michael, you spoke about the image of Paul crawling on his belly, that was treacherous. I have images of Paul on his belly or near his belly, looking for the CDs or the book at the bottom of the shelf. I have an image of Paul on his hands and knees in that apartment building that you guys lived in when we first met, cleaning the stove, cleaning the oven for Pesach. I have a picture of that, and it's in my mind. So connected, but also so elevated. The music that he loved was where those things that he could not say and express to his loved ones, that's where it resided. Paul always knew, until unfortunately the last couple of years, what he wanted to listen to, because he knew what would feed his nefesh and his neshama. And he went to the stacks of CDs and played what would feed him. His music, whether it was classical or interpretive jazz or listening to John Schott's guitar, klezmer music, that was where he healed. That was where he expressed his nefeshes, was when he played and when he listened to music. And as you said, he lived fully through the struggles, through the lows, through the highs. through the physical betrayals of his body. Oh, I have to tell you, I was very angry at his body. But like we said, he always moved forward and he brought me along. When I was a teenager, I would read novels that were placed in university towns, and I was just drawn to that. And I'm so grateful that Paul brought me into that world, into that orbit that enriched my life. I'm not an academician, but it filled, it nourished. He brought that to me. And as you all said, he gave so much to others. And when I think about joy, there's a fullness of his being a Saba and a Zaidi. When we went to Israel and met his first granddaughter, Ella, she was little in a stroller, and we would take her along the beach in Tel Aviv. And he was so happy. And that's what he felt with each of his grandchildren. And the joy that was on his face at the very end of his days, when his youngest granddaughter, Maya, her mom would hold her, lean her over to Paul in his wheelchair, and he would kiss his kepi. And there was so much joy, so much joy, so much joy that he brought joy. There was joy in his nefesh. There was joy in his nefesh.
A letter from Gabi reflecting on the last week that she spent with Paul and on the love felt at those moments. I will first read it per Gabi's request in Hebrew, and then I'll share her English translation as well. Abba אהוב שלי. תמונת האדם ברגעי מותו כתמונת נוף משתנה. הגוף שהיה חשוף לפגעי הזמן משתבלל לתוך עצמו בתנוחה וברית. פרפורי הגסיסה כמשק כנפי פרפרים נשמעים כרחשי מכשיר האולטרסאונד המדמים את גוף העובר ברחם אמו. כך רגעי המוות חופפים לרגעי הלידה. תנועת אחות מסורה מחוללת סביב מקדש הגוף ככהנת בקוריאוגרפיה של ריטואלים המלווים את הכנת הגוף, המפיח חיים בראשונה, וכעת לקראת מותו בקץ ימיו. התנועה בחלל מעגלית והפעולות חוזרות ונשנות בקצב אג'יו איטי. אלה רגעים בחייו של אדם בהם רק הוא שולט, רגעים בהם הוא פותח ומסיים את סימפוניית חייו, רוח אלוהית מרחפת בהם. המוות שלך, אבא, הוא הפרק האיטי בסימפוניה. רגעים עגומים ועצובים בהם אתה כמאובן, שצבר את זיכרונות מסע חייו. נושם את נשמותיך האחרונות. צולל אל מצולות העולם הבא, כמפה שנצרבו בה עצב, שמחה, יגון, כאב ואשמה. ועכשיו זה מחילה. זמן לנחמה וחמלה. כעת אתה קונחייה במעיין חיי הנסתר. זיכרונות של ילדה עם כתר זהב. אתה בוחר להיפרד באיטיות מן העולם, מערכות הגוף והנשמה קורסות בעצלתיים זו אחר זו. עיניך נעצמות ושוקעות אל תוך עצמן. האור המתוח אט אט נפרש ורפוי, משנה את פניו. גופך נאנח, מתאמץ, מתנשף, ולבסוף נכנע ונסוג למנוחה שקטה ונכונה. כעת אני מלטפת את ידיך שהזמן נתן בהם סימנים, את שערך שהאפיר, את עצמות לחייך הגבוהות והיפות, עכשיו זמן פיוס הנשמות והנשימות, פרפורי הגסיסה של שנינו מתמסרים לפרידה. נסעתי בזמן כדי לאהוב אותך. ילדיי היפים דורשים משלומך ועוטפים את שארית היותך בחייהם שלהם. My beloved Father, the image of a person in the moments of his death depicts an altering landscape. The body that was exposed to the ravages of time curls into itself in a fetal position. The flutters of death, like the flapping of butterfly wings, are heard as the sounds of the ultrasound device simulating the body of the fetus in its mother's womb. Thus, the moments of death coincide with the moments of birth. A dedicated nurse's movement is generated around the temple of the body as a priestess in the choreography of rituals that accompany the preparation of the body that breathes life at the beginning, and now towards its death at the end of its days. The movement in the space is circular and the actions are repeated in a slow, agios rhythm. These are moments in a person's life that only he controls. Moments in which he opens and ends the symphony of his life. A divine spirit hovers in them. Your death, Father, is the slow movement of a symphony. Dismal and sad moments in which you are like a fossil that has accumulated the memories of his life's journey, taking your last breaths, plunging into the depths of the next world like a map on which sadness, joy, grief, pain, and guilt have been inscribed. And now it's time for forgiveness, a time for comfort and compassion. You are now a shell in the hidden spring of life, memories of a girl with a golden crown. You choose to slowly say goodbye to the world. The body and soul systems collapse lazily one after the other. Your eyes close and sink into themselves. The stretched skin slowly unfolds and relaxes, changing its shades. Your body sighs, strains, pants, and finally gives in and retreats to a quiet and proper rest. Now I caress your hands that time has left marks on, your gray hair, your tall and beautiful cheekbones. Now is the time to reconcile souls and breaths. The dying flickers of both of us surrender to separation. I traveled in time to love you. My beautiful children send their regards and wrap the rest of your existence in their own lives. Adonai בינות ירביצני, על מי מנוחות ינעלני. נפשי ישובר, נפשי ישובר, ינחני במעגלי צדק למען שמו. גם כי אלך בגיא צלמוות, את לא אירא, כי אתה עמדי, שבטך ומשענתך, שבטך ומשענתך, המה ינחמוני, תערוך לפני שולחן, תערוך לפני שולחן, תערוך לפני שולחן, נגד צורר. דישנת בשם אנושי, דישנת בשם אנושי, דישנת בשם אנושי, כוסי רוויה. אך טוב וחסד ירדפוני כל ימי חיי, ושבתי בבית השם, ושבתי בבית אדוני לאורך ימים. יאי די די די, יאי 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 יאי, יאי 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 יאי. Take a moment to just invite the mourners to rise. Yuval, Sigalit, Mimi, Michael, Eric, all the relatives who are here to just rise, and they will be the first ones to leave the sanctuary, and we will follow them outside and head towards the cemetery to perform the levaya, the burial for our dear friend Paul. Thank you for being here this morning. Shiva this evening, our afternoon, is from 4 to 8 p.m. at the home of Joel and Irene Reznikov. Mincha services will begin at 6:10 p.m. Thank you.